Brother John had given me the opportunity to tell you just a little bit, and I'll try to be as brief as I can, about the ministry that we're pursuing now, and then we'll open the scriptures together in just a moment. I had pastored a church in the western part of North Carolina from 1987 until 2005. Prior to that, I had served in a couple of churches as assistant pastors, as an assistant pastor, and had traveled 4 or 5 years in evangelism as well. And then in 87, a church in Brevard, North Carolina asked me to come and be their lead pastor, and accepted that call to go there. And during that time, I had the opportunity to make some trips to the mission field. I had never really, what you would say, I'd been to England one time early in the 80s, but as far as going to some other mission trip on a regular basis, I'd never really done that. To make a long story short, I had the privilege to visit several while I was pastoring there in North Carolina. Lithuania, Mexico, India, South America, and some places, a variety of places really, Philippines. And as I began to visit those places and began to have the opportunity to minister and do some short conferences and seminars, workshops, and things like that, I began to ask myself the question, is this something that I could do regularly? Is this something I could do permanently? Do I even have anything to offer these people? And what do you say to that? I mean, we are what we are by the grace of God. God's providence has brought us through, a journey of theological development and ministry development and so forth. And so I began to ask myself some of those questions. My wife and I began to pray together, and I began to seek some counsel and some input. And when I turned 50 back in 2004, I asked myself the question at that point, if God gives me another good, strong 15 to 20 years, how could I be the best steward of what I had been given, what I had been taught, what my education, my experience, my pastoral practice, and so forth. So I began to ask some of those questions, and like the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 12 and verse 3, I certainly didn't want to think of myself more highly than I should. I wanted to have a humble approach. I wanted, in sincerity, I certainly didn't want to think that I was, had something to offer that wasn't there, but he did say to evaluate yourself soberly and to think soberly, so I wanted to have the right kind of balance in determining that. So again, to make a long story short, in 2005 I resigned the church in Brevard, North Carolina, which is over in the western part of the state near Asheville, Hendersonville, that area. And we moved over to Greensboro, which is in the middle of the state. A friend of mine pastored a work there, Faithway Baptist Church. And they wanted to enhance their missions program. They wanted to add a component to their missions program that I was interested in, and that was primarily focused on equipping the next generation, training pastors and training pastors to train pastors. So in 2005, my wife and I sold our home. We moved over to Greensboro. We were authorized by that church to do the ministry that we're involved in now. That is our Antioch, as it were, as Paul was sent out from Antioch in Acts 13. The church in Greensboro is now our Antioch. That's where we're accountable, both theologically, financially. That's where our board is. That's where our anchor is at Faithway Baptist Church, and we're very thankful for what the church has done for us. And if I could summarize in a nutshell what we do, it is essentially look for training bases to open in various parts of the world where those pastors are willing to learn and eager to learn and are willing to give a long-term commitment, at least 8 years, maybe 10 years, where we can go back year after year, develop relationships, build credibility, build on what we've taught the year before, and establish some kind of continuity in that ministry. So we ask them for that kind of commitment, and we're willing to give them that kind of commitment. And by the grace of God, we've been able to see that happen in several countries. We just got back recently from South America back in April. I was in the Ivory Coast in February. I'm headed to the Philippines this October. We're considering doubling up in the Ivory Coast. The missionary that we're working with there is going to be launching a Bible college and seminary when they get back from furlough, which they're on right now here in the States, so when they go back. So we're considering going over there twice a year We're also considering the possibility of Bolivia. We have a young couple that we support in our church that has been there for 1 or 2 terms now and has a small group of men that he's in the process of training. So our passion is to see the next generation of shepherds properly equipped to be able to pastor and shepherd and guide and lead and care for biblically the congregations that God raises up. So that really is where we are. We would appreciate your prayers for that. That God would not only supply our needs, but would give us wisdom as we travel and prepare and put workshops and conferences and so forth together. One of the things that, one of the networks that we have to have together with these conferences is a network of translators. We want to translate the notes into the language of the people. And so far we've had to do that in French and Spanish, and we've got several of our modules translated into those languages. Last year when we were with Brother Raymond, we had that translated into Arabic, and so that's what we're about. That's what we're trying to invest our life in now, and until God sees differently. We're very content doing this. It's exciting to be able to see what God is doing, and one of the practical results of what we're trying to accomplish is anchored in 2 Timothy 2:2 text, where Paul says, the things that you have heard from me, Timothy, 2 generations, you find faithful, capable men, 3rd generation, who can commit that and teach others also, 4th generation. So what we're trying to encourage these men to do that we train is not just sit there and soak up what we're teaching them, but to begin to weave that into the fabric of their congregations, to sort of knead that into the dough of their preaching ministries, of their Sunday school ministries, of their Bible study ministries, and then for them to coordinate among themselves and to reach out and establish their own training conferences, so that they are now passing that on not just to their own local congregations, but now they're equipping other pastors and other leaders in churches. And we've been able to see that happen in the Philippines, in Uruguay, and in the Ivory Coast. So we're very thankful that God is putting these teams of nationals who are willing to take it to the next generation. So thank you for the opportunity to share that. I'd like for you to turn in your Bibles, if you would please, to the book of 1 Samuel. Brother Steve said before the service he didn't think he had ever seen a text this long in this church. Well, my goal is not to read it all, but we're going to try to cover the principles that God has laid down in this text. All of us, from time to time, feel the pressures of life. It may be financial pressures. It may be family pressures in marital relationships, or trying to rear our children for the glory of God. It may be ecclesiastical pressures, where we're trying to hold the line on some theological doctrine, or trying to maintain by the grace of God the purity of the church and follow the principles that Christ has laid down. So there's always going to be pressures of some sort. Where do we run when those pressures come? Where do we find our solace? Where do we find comfort and stability? And where do we look to as our Savior? What becomes our Savior, our contentment, the bottom line that we run to and flee to and rest during those times? The book of 1 Samuel opens in sort of a unique way, because it opens with a dysfunctional family. Here's a husband with 2 wives, and then we see the adversarial relationship between these 2 wives. One is certainly aggravating the other because of a certain set of circumstances in her life. So we see immediately that as this book opens, there's family problems. There's a disjointed, dysfunctional, wrong-sighted kind of perspective on what a biblical family should be, and it certainly creates all kinds of problems and pressures. Let's begin reading in verse 1. There was a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim of the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, the son of Jehoram, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zuph, an Ephrathite. He had 2 wives. The name of the one was Hannah, the name of the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. Now this man used to go up year by year from his city to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts at Shiloh, where the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests of the Lord. On the day when Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to Peninnah his wife and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion, because he loved her, though the Lord had closed up her womb. And her rival used to provoke her grievously to irritate her, because the Lord had closed up her womb. So it went on year by year. As often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she used to provoke her. Therefore Hannah wept and would not eat. And Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? And why do you not eat? And why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons? After they had eaten and drunk in Shiloh, Hannah arose. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. That's where we'll stop with our reading. You're probably somewhat familiar with the flow of the text. Here's Hannah. She's grieved because she has no child. Here's Peninnah. She's adversarial to Hannah because she's got several. So it becomes a battle. It becomes competition, as I guess we would assume that it would if a man chooses to have 2 wives. And then, of course, as the story unfolds, Hannah is able to have that child as Eli meets her at the temple praying, and she is able to have that child. And then as we move into chapter 2, the first 10 verses of chapter 2 becomes a reaction on Hannah's part to the answer to prayer that she received in the first chapter. But as we go through this passage, there are 5 basic lessons that I think flow out of this text that teach us about Hannah and her God, that teach us what Hannah looked to, what her foundation was, what her ultimate source of consolation was, the ultimate lifesaver, as it were, the one that she looked to, where she went. But it wasn't just some kind of superficial routine that she would go through, because, and we'll see that a little bit later in chapter 2, which is really some of the most exciting verses in this passage, because it reveals Hannah to be the theological lady that she was. She was not some, and I mean no disrespect, she was not just a Sunday school graduate. This little lady knew her God. So what are these lessons that we can learn about this God that Hannah looked to? First of all, in verses 2 and 5, the text that we read, we see that Hannah recognized God as being sovereign. That the text shows us about this attribute of God being fleshed out in the life of this young lady, this young wannabe mother. Peninnah had 5 or 6, Hannah had none. But how is this particular attribute of God displayed in this passage about the sovereignty of God? He is in control. But how do we see that? Why can we say from this passage that God is in control? Verse 2, it says clearly that Hannah had no child. Okay. Maybe she had biological problems. Maybe Elkanah was sterile. Maybe, it was a set of circumstances. Maybe this, maybe that. But that's not the reason, because down in verse 5, it tells us exactly why she was barren. God closed her womb. Now, you can't get any more personal, any more intimate, any more direct involved in someone's life than that God intentionally and purposefully, not accidentally, He didn't just allow her womb to be closed, He closed it. He's sovereign. He orchestrated this in her life. He didn't just know that she was going to be barren. He didn't just sort of let the course of life unfold so that she became barren. It says clearly that God shut her womb. Now, are you okay with that? Because we all have circumstances in our life that we maybe don't want, that we maybe don't appreciate, that we maybe don't ask for, that we maybe realize are unexplainable, and that we realize we're uninvited. And maybe all of those things and others could be said about this situation with Hannah. But she has no children because God intervened in her life and made her barren. Why would God do that? I don't know. Why does God do what He does in a lot of things? I don't know. Ultimately, we know the answer to that question. For His glory. That in the ages to come He might show the exceeding riches of His kindness in us through Christ Jesus. We know ultimately why God does what He does. It's for His glory and the good of His people. We know the practicality, at least academically, of Romans 8:28. That all things work together for good to them that love God and to those who are the called according to His purpose. And what is that purpose? Verse 29, that we might be conformed to the image of Christ. So we understand those kinds of principles, but we don't know why He made her barren for this long and why He let Peninnah have 5 or 6 kids and provoke her sore and ridicule her. And we don't understand all that. We don't know that. But those aren't the things that we need to understand. I think it's Deuteronomy 29:29 that says the secret things belong to the Lord. The things that are revealed, those are the things that belong to us. So I don't need to figure out the mind of an infinite God why He would choose to work this set of circumstances the way that He worked this set of circumstances. But in our lives, as His children, oftentimes we're faced with similar type situations. It may be family, it may be financial, it may be job related, it may be relationship related if we're not married. So there may be job, it may be in all kinds of situations that we don't understand. But the fact of the matter is that God is displaying, He is the main actor. This is not primarily a story about Hannah. This is a story about the God of Hannah. This is the story about the one who is, front and center, that is the protagonist, that the lead actor. This is about God dealing with Hannah and showing us how He interacts with His people. So God is directly involved in Hannah's life. He's directly involved in your life. God is at work despite multiple problems. In verse 2, you see a distorted model of marriage. And Elkanah, he had 2 wives. We could talk about that for a while, but I'm not sure that we need to. I mean, how could the unity principle, the creative design of God in Genesis chapter 2, how could that be functioning as it should in this kind of scenario? The one flesh pattern that God established, the unity of one man for one woman for life as God intended, is essentially impossible. But that's not necessarily the point. It is sort of a sub-point. The primary point is that God is not hindered by the stupidity of mankind, by the irresponsible decisions, by the lack of following biblical God is not hindered by that. He didn't scratch his head and say, oh my goodness, what am I going to do with Hannah now? She happens to be, a co-wife to Elkanah, and she doesn't have any children, and I'm up against a wall. God is able to work despite the circumstances of man. And He does just that in this scenario. The circumstances in your life, are there some there that you wish weren't? Are there some there that maybe shouldn't be there and maybe you didn't ask for or invite? That doesn't become a hindrance to God. That doesn't become a stumbling block. That doesn't cause God to throw up his hands and say, okay, I missed that one. I haven't thought that one through. But we see a sovereign God that is completely in control. Regardless of the decisions of man, regardless of the violation of biblical principles that's clear and plain in this passage. So you see a distorted model of marriage in verse 2. In verse 8, you see a husband. Let me read this verse again. It's interesting the way that Elkanah approached his wife. He said, why do you weep? Now, on the surface, that sounded like a pretty good question. Why are you crying? I mean, some of you husbands have probably asked your wife that question a time or two. Honey, what's wrong? What's going on? Why do you weep? And why aren't you eating? Okay, maybe that's not too bad a question. Why is your heart sad? And all of those may be okay questions. You're not eating, you're crying, I come home from work, you're emotional, I don't understand what's going on, and your heart's sad. But then he throws this kicker in. Am I not better unto you than 10 sons? He just spoiled the whole thing. It was obvious that he didn't understand his wife. It was obvious that he really wasn't concerned about her responding to these questions that he asked. It seems to be pretty obvious that these questions were just sort of, machine gun style fired at her so that he could really get to the bottom line of his attitude. Why don't you just dry up and quit whining? Because after all, am I not better unto you than 10 sons? I mean, here's a woman desperate for a child, which is completely non-understandable by a man. But here she is being provoked by her adversary, Peninnah. And here he is just going after her. Why are you crying? Why aren't you eating? Why are you upset? And hey, I mean, look at me. You married up when you married me. I mean, can't I do it for you? Am I not meeting that, filling that bill for you? Well, the fact of the matter is, no, you're not. That's the answer. But he makes the statement in verse 5, or the scriptures narrate for us in verse 5, that unto Hannah he had given a double portion. I mean, he was coming at this thing because, after all, he had already demonstrated what he would consider a display of love to Hannah, because even though Peninnah had all of these children, it says that he loved her and he had given her a double portion. Now, the question is, a double portion of what? It wasn't a double portion of understanding. It wasn't a double portion of consideration. It wasn't a double portion of helping her develop a theocentric view of her circumstances based on the God that they claim to be worshiping here in Shiloh. It wasn't a double portion of that. It wasn't a double portion of spousal counseling and, honey, let me show you from Scripture and let me talk to you. Let's think about this from God's Spirit. It wasn't a double portion of any of that. What was it? It was a double portion of stuff. So at the bottom line, he asked the question, how can you be so sad when you've got so much stuff? And I'm the one that gave it to you. So dry up and quit whining. Stuff doesn't fix marriages, does it? Stuff doesn't bring happiness when your soul is wrung out over a wayward child, or a dysfunctional marriage, or a bitter wife, or an unfaithful husband. Money doesn't fix it. And this was a situation that only God could fix. It didn't matter how many piles of stuff he gave his wife. It didn't matter how many cars or how many wardrobes or how many new homes or how many yachts or how many places on the beach or anything else. It didn't matter about all of that, because nothing was going to fill the vacuum that she was experiencing in her life. But hey, this was Elkanah. This was her understanding husband. Haven't I been good to you? I've given you lots of stuff. If your problem and my problem can be fixed with more stuff, then we're pretty pitiful people. Let me just sort of take the desperation out of your heart over your children or over your marriage or over your relationship to God that maybe has gone south. Or let me just offer you $250,000 and just dry up and quit whining. Does that work? Certainly not. Certainly not. And certainly not in this situation that was an only God can fix it situation. God made her barren. Only God can reverse that. So we see God's sovereign working in this whole situation. Number two, your God-ordained circumstance may bring criticism and ridicule from others. God is wise. And the circumstances that Hannah finds herself in are not by mistake. God is not trying to tease her. God is not trying to persecute her. God is not trying to make life miserable in some kind of arbitrary way. But He is demonstrating His wisdom in the circumstances that Hannah finds herself in because of what eventually is going to happen. One commentator I thought was interesting, by the name of W.G. Blakey, makes this statement. He says, if Peninnah had been kind to Hannah, Samuel might never have been born. It was the unbearable harshness of Peninnah that drove Hannah to the throne of grace. Is it not sometimes that way in our life? The unbearable, what we think, what we have concluded is the unbearableness of this relationship, the unbearableness of not having a job and not being able to provide for your family, and the bills are in the rears and bill collectors are calling and the bank wants to foreclose. Is it not the unbearable circumstances of life that sometimes in God's sovereignty and His providence He uses in His wisdom to bring us right where we need to be, and that's to Him? If everything went well all of the time, all of the bills were paid, all the kids were healthy, new car every year, or Harley, whatever it might be, then we might tend to be a little bit more passive, a little bit more apathetic. But in this situation, the wisdom of God brings adversarial criticism year after year after year. Not just once, not just twice, but year after year. All of the times that Peninnah is having these children and they're going up to the temple to worship and they're living in the same house together, Hannah is the recipient of Peninnah's constant adversarial criticism. But knowing God is your anchor for comfort. Do you face provocation, harassment at work, ridicule or criticism at school, or in your neighborhoods, or in your family? Because of a variety of things: your age, your appearance, your family background, your Christianity, your love for God, your passion for Christ, your height, your weight, your marriage status, your financial status. All of those can become targets for the critics. And many of those, if not all of those, are there because of a sovereign God, a wise sovereign God. Because God doesn't act one way with one attribute in one set of circumstances and then sort of set that aside and say, okay, now I'm going to act with another attribute over here in another set of circumstances. He acts as all God all of the time. So whether it's sovereignty or wisdom or His goodness or His holiness or His wrath or His omniscience or His omnipresence or His immutability or whatever it is, He always acts as He is in His totality. He's sovereign. He brings this set of circumstances to bear in the life of Hannah in His wisdom. Now, if you would have asked Hannah what her preference would have been, she would have probably had a different preference. She would have probably said, you know, Lord, enough of the barren stuff. You know, if you want to work in a different way, that's okay, but okay, you know, can you let me have a little bit of relief over here? Oftentimes our response is to fuss, to fret. But one of the things that we're going to see in a moment when Hannah really erupts in praise is that she knows this God. She's not bickering, she's not belly aching, she's not asking God for a different set of circumstances. She's not even, as far as we know from the text, we're not even seeing her retaliate against Peninnah. So she seems to be handling it okay, even though she's very unapologetic about the grief that she's experiencing. That's very clear. That's very out in the open. So God is sovereign. God is wise. In verses 10 through 15, it's evident that God cares. Take your burdens to God. He cares. He's attentive. He's full of mercy and compassion. He invites you to come. Let us come boldly to the throne of grace that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help at the right time. He invites us to come. The Geneva Study Bible says about this passage in 1 Samuel with regard to Eli. Eli's conclusion that Hannah was drunk, which you see as if you read down through verse 15, 10 through 15. Hannah's there in the temple, she's praying, her mouth is moving, and Eli misinterprets what's going on. And the comment is Eli's conclusion that Hannah was drunk is an unsettling element in the narrative because it suggests that he was unfamiliar with fervency in prayer. Here's a woman that's desperate and Eli misses the whole deal. He thinks she's babbling on because she's drunk, rather than understanding that here's a woman in deep, deep despair. But this is where she goes. She didn't go to some vice. She didn't go to some group. She didn't go to some illicit relationship. She didn't go, here and there. And she went exactly where she needs to go. In verse 8, she weeps. Verse 10, she wept. Verse 12, she continued to pray. Verse 15, she poured out her soul before God. Verse 15, she experiences a sorrowful spirit. Verse 16, she grieves. This is who Hannah was. She was as I mentioned, very unapologetic about her emotions and her feelings and the condition of her soul. She was desperate. And in her desperation, she went exactly where she should have gone. To the throne of grace. Is that where we go? As a knee-jerk reaction. Now eventually we may sort of waddle our way to the throne of grace. We may sort of meander there eventually. But is that where we go initially? Because we are cognizant of the fact that when difficulties in life seem to be unbearable, that there is only one place that's worth going. And that's where we're invited to come, to the throne of grace, to obtain well-timed help. That's where she went. She was desperate. Have you ever been desperate? You know, I ask myself that question. Now, I don't mean desperate because you missed the sale at Macy's on Saturday, or that Walmart closed at 10 and you didn't make it till 11 and you were bummed out. I mean desperate because something was going on in your soul. Have you ever got desperate because the relationship between you and your spouse is not what it should be? Have you ever been desperate because one of your children seems to be moving away from God and your heart is breaking and you don't know what to do? Yes, you prayed. Yes, you've counseled. Yes, you've reached out. Yes, you've gone through all of that, but you don't know what else to do and your heart is aching so bad. Where do you go? Hannah shows us where to go. Her theology dictated to her where she went. This was not just some superficial routine that she went through as just hoping that maybe if she said the same words over long enough or begged the priest enough times that something would change. Her theology is what drove her to this place. God invites you to come. Number 4, God answers prayer. He's loving, kind, and beneficent. In verses 17 through 28, we see this whole story laid out with regard to Hannah's prayer, with regard to God's gracious answer. Now, in Hannah's situation, she said, I want a child. God said, okay. Now, in our situation, it doesn't always work that way, does it? God doesn't always say, okay, you're going to get exactly what you asked for. As a matter of fact, I'd like for that to happen a little more often. But God is a wise God. God knows that I'm not asking properly a lot of the times. He knows what, and all of that is being reflected here. But for Hannah, she got exactly what she asked for. But the irony of what happened to Hannah is that she got it and then gave it back. The ultimate demonstration from a mother, from Hannah's perspective, the ultimate demonstration of love and worship and sacrifice and being able to demonstrate that to God was, God, please give me a son so I can give him back to you. I can present him to you as a servant sacrificed by me. I'll try to do my best to raise him, but as soon as he's weaned, he's coming back to you. One man said at one time, next to a divorce, children can break your heart as quick as anything when they're not doing right. But at the same time, they can be a big blessing too. You train your children right, you teach them right, you do the best you can, and when they follow Christ, what a joy that is. That doesn't put a feather in our cap because it's only by God's grace. It's not because we worked the techniques out. It's not because we've, maneuvered the pawns on the chessboard and such, and the planets aligned and everything set up just right so our kids turned out right. It's all a tribute to the grace and goodness of God. But what a joy they can be. God answers prayer. And number 5, and this really takes us to chapter 2, and I know we haven't obviously covered every verse in this chapter. I think Steve's probably relieved about that. But in chapter 2, verses 1 through 10, the first chapter flows right in. I mean, Hannah's relationship with God, she doesn't miss a tick. And I guess maybe it's unfortunate that there's a chapter division there, because in chapter 1 we see the prayer of petition. A desperate woman crying out to God under these circumstances, uninvited, unwanted, criticism, ridicule. And again, it's not all about Hannah. This story is, she's obviously one of the characters on the stage, but she's not the lead character. This is about the God of Hannah. and how he responds and what he's doing with his people. And so it flows right into chapter 2. And as soon, at least in the text, as soon as we see all of these circumstances unfold in chapter 1, God answers her prayer. She takes Samuel up to the temple, gives him back to God, and so forth and so on. Here she erupts in a prayer of praise. A prayer of petition, chapter 1, a prayer of praise. And God is worthy of both. God is worthy that we go to him and ask, because he's the only one that can reverse the circumstances of life. He's the only one that can undo the bad things. He's the only one that can reverse what we think is, unbearable in our lives. So we run to God. We're invited to come. He delights when we come. And then in chapter 2, she erupts by giving him praise and glory and worship. Just as intensely, just as desperately, just as quickly as she went to him in prayer in chapter 1. Oftentimes we forget that part, don't we? We ask God, beg God, whine a little bit, bellyache a little bit. Okay, God, And then when things sort of work out, the praise part, the worship part, the attributing glory to him and because he alone is worthy, that part sometimes gets left out. Not with this young lady. She was a walking theologian. You could take chapter 2, verses 1 through 10, and teach a mini course in theology about the character of God, because she acknowledges him to be so many things. Verse 1, her deliverer. Verse 2, his holiness. Verse 2, that he is the only God. Verse 2 again, he is her strength, he is her security, neither is there any rock like our God. Verse 3, he is knowledgeable and just. And here it comes in verses 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, he is the God of reversals. Did he not reverse her situation? That was what she wanted. That was what he deemed appropriate in her life, and he reversed that. But she illustrates it in different ways. Verse 4, military might is reversed. Verse 4, feeble conditions are reversed. Verse 5, material conditions are reversed. Verse 5 again, domestic conditions are reversed. Verse 6, life itself, death and life are reversed. Verse 7, economic conditions. And verse 7 and 8, social status is reversed. She just goes on and on and on about how this sovereign, loving, wise, beneficent, prayer-answering, concerned Heavenly Father has come to her rescue and reversed all of the circumstances that seem to be against her. And she says he does the same thing in life. He's that kind of God. And in verses 9 and 10, he protects and defends his own. So let me close with a couple of questions. Are you overwhelmed with your circumstances? Do the difficulties of life seem to be at the brink of being unbearable? And sometimes they do. But let's be honest. But if and when they do, Hannah shows us where to go. She points up to the only one who can do anything about it, and to the one that needs to be acknowledged for his wisdom and providential dealing in the circumstances, even if they don't change. Hannah says it's God. He's the one. So amidst whatever difficulties may be pressing on all sides in your life that may create fear or fretfulness or weariness or perplexity, this God, Hannah's God, your God, is sovereign. He's wise, he's strong, he knows, he listens, he's loving, he's attentive, he responds, and he's the God of reversals. And he alone is worthy of worship and praise. Now, this knowledge that Hannah had of this God was not just mere academic. She didn't just make, ace out the latest test in her class on theology. This is what she lived. This is how she functioned. So her theology was an accurate, functioning theology about God. Not just an academic acquiescence to some facts about something that she heard. It was how she lived her life. It's demonstrated, it's laid out. And I challenge you this afternoon, that's your God. That's our God, who can do for us and be for us in whatever the circumstance may be, exactly what He was for Hannah. May we acknowledge Him not just in the petition part, but may we also acknowledge Him in the praise and worship part. God bless you.